She was just a little girl selling flowers by the roadside, barefoot, smiling, and invisible to the world rushing past her. Until one stormy evening, an old woman stopped and gave her the only money she had left, 15 rupees. No one knew that small act would set off a chain of events the next day that would leave an entire town speechless. What could possibly happen that would make strangers cry, and a forgotten child remembered by everyone? This isn't just a story about kindness, it's about what it revealed. In a small crowded neighborhood on the edge of the city lived Asha, a quiet little girl with eyes too old for her age. Every morning she stood near the traffic light with a basket of wilted flowers, her tiny hands stretching towards strangers who rarely looked back. Life had taught her early that smiles don't always bring kindness, and poverty doesn't always earn compassion. Across the street, in a dimly lit apartment, lived Parveen, an elderly widow who survived on what little her late husband's pension offered. Most days she sat by the window, watching the world rush past, unnoticed, forgotten, like Asha herself. They had never spoken before that day. Two souls from different generations, both invisible in a city that measured worth by wealth and color. But when the skies turned gray and rain began to fall, fate placed them on the same corner, an old woman clutching her last few rupees, and a little girl shivering beneath a plastic sheet. Neither of them knew it yet. But that brief moment, one small act of compassion, would uncover something far darker than poverty. Something that would force an entire town to question who the real victims were. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but whispers had begun. Asha's tiny figure stood once again near the same crossing, clutching the old woman's 15 rupees like a treasure. She wanted to buy new flowers, fresher ones that would finally make people notice her. But as she approached the stall, a group of men blocked her path. They weren't strangers, just familiar faces hardened by bias and bitterness. One of them laughed, pointing at her dark skin smeared with dust. "Why waste good flowers on someone like her?" he sneered. The others joined in, their words sharp as stones. Asha froze, her small body trembling. She didn't understand all their words, but she understood their tone, the same one that had followed her since birth. When she tried to move past, a hand snatched the money from her grip. "You think people pity you for being poor?" Another man spat. "They pity you for existing." Across the road, Parveen saw everything. The laughter, the mockery, the cruelty so casual it seemed practiced. Something in her broke. That night she went to the market, determined to find Asha, but the child was gone. The next morning, crowds gathered near the same spot. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had found a basket of flowers scattered on the road, crushed under heavy boots, and beside it, the same plastic sheet Asha had used to shield herself from the rain. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said Asha had been taken by men who thought she'd stolen money. Others whispered she'd been beaten and left behind the stalls. But no one wanted to know the truth. It was easier to stay silent. Parveen refused to. She went to the police, her frail voice shaking as she spoke. They listened for a moment, then smiled faintly. "It's not our concern," one officer muttered. "Girls like her disappear every day." That sentence echoed in her mind. Girls like her. Not children, not victims. Just a category, disposable. The old woman walked out into the same rain-soaked street where she'd first met Asha. Each step felt heavier than the last. People stared but didn't stop her. She stopped at the crossing, her eyes fixed on the spot where the child once stood. And there, beneath the puddles, she saw it, a single crushed flower. Still clinging to color despite the mud, she picked it up, her hands trembling as the city lights flickered above. Something inside her whispered that this wouldn't end with silence. Not this time, because sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest truths, if someone dares to listen. The next morning, Parveen returned to the police station, not as a quiet widow, but as a storm. Her voice, once frail, cut through the murmurs of the officers lounging behind their desks. She held up Asha's crushed flower in her trembling hand. "This," she said, "was worth more than your silence." The room fell still. One of the officers smirked, ready to dismiss her again, but she didn't stop. She told them everything, about the men, the laughter, the way they treated the little girl like she was less than human. Her words shook with grief, but behind the tremor was fire. When the station refused to file a report, Parveen walked outside and stood on the same corner where Asha had sold her flowers. The traffic roared around her, but she didn't move. People stared. Cameras came out. In a world addicted to outrage, her stillness became impossible to ignore. By evening, her story had spread. Crowds gathered, some out of sympathy, others out of curiosity. Reporters shouted questions, but Parveen said nothing. She simply held up that single crushed flower to the lenses, her eyes unblinking. And then, from the back of the crowd, a man's voice broke through, one of the same men who had mocked Asha. "You don't know what really happened," he yelled, but his face betrayed him, fear, guilt, and something darker. The crowd turned toward him. Questions turned into anger. Shouts filled the air. For the first time, those who had watched in silence began to speak, to remember, to accuse, to demand answers. The truth that the city tried to bury was now unfolding in the open, raw, undeniable, and in that chaos, Parveen whispered, barely audible but strong enough for the cameras to catch. "If a flower can't survive here, what chance does a child have?" The crowd went silent. The truth had finally found a voice, one that no one could ignore anymore. Days passed, but the city could no longer look away. The image of Parveen, the frail woman holding a crushed flower in the middle of the street, spread across every screen, every headline. What began as whispers turned into questions. What began as pity turned into anger. The authorities who once laughed at her silence now faced the weight of a nation's outrage. Investigations were opened, denials were made, and slowly, the truth surfaced. Asha had been beaten, not for stealing, not for lying, but for daring to exist where people thought she didn't belong. They called it a tragic misunderstanding, but Parveen knew better. She knew it wasn't tragedy. It was cruelty dressed as indifference. In the following weeks, people began leaving flowers by that same roadside corner. First a few, then hundreds. Not all of them knew Asha's name, but they knew her story. They saw her face in every child ignored by the world. They heard her silence in the spaces where justice should have spoken. Parveen never asked for fame. She only wanted one thing, for people to see that compassion should never depend on the color of someone's skin or the weight of their wallet. Some said she changed nothing. But that wasn't true, because from that day forward, every time a passerby saw a child selling flowers, they looked twice, and sometimes they stopped. And maybe that's where change begins, not with grand speeches or headlines, but with one small act of humanity that dares to break the pattern. "We can't bring her back," Parveen once said, "but we can stop pretending we don't see her." The question now isn't what happened to Asha, it's how many Ashas still wait to be seen.